Now, close your eyes, if you like, dim the lights. Turn on a fan for a whisper of wind. Wrap yourself in a blanket. Let the sound of my voice be the only thing you need to follow. Wherever you are in the other side of the world, or just down the road, I'm glad you've joined me. We begin not with a war or a coronation, but with silence. Cold, damp, the kind that creeps into your bones and lingers, even when the fire is lit. The year is 1290, and in a small village near the banks of the river Forth, a girl is buried. She is only 7 years old. Her name Margaret. They'll call her the Maid of Norway, but no songs will be written for her. No bard will weep at court in her name. She will vanish into history almost as quickly as she arrived in it. And yet her death will unmake a kingdom. It begins here at the edge of something vast. Scotland stands on the precipice of collapse. A crown without a head, a land without peace. And just beyond the border, in England, a king is waiting. Edward Longshanks. A name already heavy with blood and ambition. He has been watching. Waiting. And now, with the child queen buried and no heir to the throne, he will move like ice across stone. But let's slow down. Let's feel the weight of that winter first. It is early December, and the air is sharp. Frost coats the bare branches of the birch trees lining the village roads. The croft small thatched cottages of stone and turf glow faintly with the smoke of peat fires. There's a hush, not just from the snow, but from fear. Rumors are traveling faster than carts can carry them. The nobles are arguing, the crown is lost, and worse, much worse, they say the English might come. The people feel it in their gut, a churning, a dread that no prayer seems to ease. Margaret's death should have been just that, the tragedy of a child too young to rule. But Scotland has no king, no clear line of succession, and the nobles, they are circling each other like wolves. 13 claimants to the throne. 13 lords, each with a trace of royal blood, all convinced their lineage is the purest, the oldest, the most rightful. Some are men of war, others men of quiet cunning. They will plead, bribe, threaten, charm. And when that fails, they will bleed each other. This is the great cause. A name that sounds noble, doesn't it? But it is chaos. It is politics played with swords, and behind it all Edward of England smiles. He offers help, mediation, peace. He tells the Scottish nobles, let me decide. I am your neighbor, after all. But Edward is no friend. He does not want to choose a king of Scotland. He wants to make one who will bow, one who will kneel. And so the nobles meet in a great hall in Berwick upon Tweed, not far from the border, under the watchful eyes of the English soldiers. Banners hang limp from the rafters. The air is thick with the breath of horses, the muttering of guards, the anxious rustle of parchment. It is John Balliol who will be crowned. A man with royal blood, yes, but weak, uncertain, a puppet. A king, in name only. And behind him, always, the shadow of Longshks. The Scots know this. They can see the strings, but for now, they tolerate them. They whisper rebellion, but they are tired, fractured, and the land itself offers no comfort. The harvests have failed in the north. Entire villages are hungry. Grain is scarce, and the price of bread has tripled in the towns. In the Highlands, the clans fight each other over grazing land, over cattle, over insults handed down like curses. And in the south, English garrisons are slowly, quietly, expanding their presence. This is a quiet invasion. No horns, no banners, no sieges. Just pressure, just presence, just power. Balliol tries to resist. He sends envoys to France, tries to make alliances, tries to play the king. But Edward is watching. And when Balliol refuses to provide troops for Edward's war with France, the mask slips. Edward declares war on Scotland. The first blow falls on Berwick. March 1296. They come like a storm. English knights, their steel polished like mirrors, their standards high and snapping in the wind. Thousands of foot soldiers, archers, siege engineers. Berwick is not prepared. The walls are old, the defenses thin, and the people. They are caught in the middle. Edward gives the order. No mercy. The massacre begins. They say it lasted 2 days. 2 days of screams, of blood running in the gutters, of flames licking the sky. The streets became rivers of ash and bone. Men were cut down where they stood. Women were dragged from homes. Children, there were no children spared. Witnesses spoke of the air thick with smoke and the iron tang of blood, of mothers cradling lifeless sons, of church doors barred shut and burned with families still inside. 7,000 died, some say more. Berwick was not conquered, it was silenced. And Edward, he laughed. He sat upon a throne of stone and declared himself Lord Paramount of Scotland. It is in that moment that something shifts. The nobles had squabbled. The lords had bowed. But now now, the people would rise. Not all at once. Not in some grand, cinematic rebellion, but in whispers, in secret oaths, in sharpened blades buried beneath floorboards, in the hearts of commoners who had nothing left somewhere to lose. In the low hills of Ayrshire, a boy watches his father hang. He will grow into a man whose name will echo through history, but not yet, for now Scotland burns. And in the ruins of Berwick, a silence falls again, the kind that comes only after unspeakable violence, the kind that waits. It will not last. Because war is coming. And in war, the dead are never silent. The silence that followed the massacre at Berwick was not peace. It was the deep, unnatural quiet that settles after a screamed quiet of the hunted, not the spared. South of the devastation, in quiet glens and forgotten hamlets, whispers passed from mouth to ear like coals passed from hand to hand. The name on those whispers was not a nobleman's, not yet a leader's, just the name of a son. A boy with fire in his chest and grief in his throat. William Wallace. He was not born into greatness. He was not the son of a king, nor trained in the courts of Europe. He was a second son, tall, quiet, and dangerous in the way a forest fire is dangerous. Slow to start, impossible to stop. They say he watched them take his father, watched them hang him like meat from a hook. Not in battle, not even in punishment. It was meant to make an example. Edward's message was clear. You are not a people, you are property. But William remembered. He learned it in shadows. He hid his blade in the folds of his cloak and his fury behind calm eyes. He hunted deer by moonlight, listened to the elders by firelight. His world was made of stone and moss and the slow, pulsing ache of vengeance. When the stories first spread, they were small. A patrol gone missing. An English tax collector found face down in the river, his ledger soaked through, the coins missing. Then came LA and ARK. It was not strategy that drove him there. It was rage. The sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg, had ordered the execution of Wallace's wife, or perhaps his betrothed. Historians bicker over the details, but the old men of the village remember a scream in the night. A woman dragged from her home, and Wallace, returning too late. They say he rode into the town with no banner, no army. Just a handful of men with knives in their belts and fire in their veins. They struck at midnight, quietly, purposefully. English soldiers never heard them coming, and by dawn, the sheriff was dead, hacked down in his own hall, his body left where the flies could find it. Lanark changed everything. What had been a flicker became a flame. Wallace didn't claim a title. He didn't sit on a throne, but men followed him all the same. Not for gold, not for glory, for vengeance, for dignity, for the right to live in their own land without bowing to a foreign crown. From village to village, his legend grew, not just as a warrior, but as a symbol. He fought like a man who had already died. Fearless, terrible. He did not wait for noblemen to give permission. He did not write letters or negotiate treaties. He led farmers, millers, blacksmiths, men with nothing to lose against armored knights and fortified keeps. And somehow ... He won. The English called him an outlaw. The Scots called him Hope. But hope, too, is dangerous. It draws attention. And in England, Edward Longshanks heard the name Wallace. He did not fear it. Not yet. He dismissed the skirmishes as peasant uprisings. He had crushed dozens like them before, but Edward underestimated one thing. Desperation cannot be reasoned with, and broken men do not fight for land or coin. They fight because they've already lost everything. By the summer of 1297, Wallace was no longer a shadow in the hills. He was a problem. English garrisons fortified their walls. Nobles in Scotland began to whisper. Perhaps this outlaw was more than a symbol. Perhaps he was what they needed. Still, the lords hesitated. They had lands to protect, titles to maintain. Many still feared Edward more than they feared Wallace's rising, but Wallace didn't wait for permission. That same summer, in a broad valley near Stirling, he made his move. The river Forth curved like a silver snake through the land. On its banks stood the narrow Stirling Bridge, the only crossing for miles. The English army, thousands strong, marched north, confident, armored, fed, and arrogant. Wallace waited in the trees. He had no cavalry, no siege engines, just high ground and patience. The English, certain of victory, began to cross the narrow bridge. One by one, hundreds crossed, but only a few hundred. The bulk of the army still waited on the other side. Then Wallace struck. Like wolves descending from the mist, the Scots charged down the hill and into the river. English soldiers on the far bank could only watch as their comrades were slaughtered, trapped between river and spear, their horses slipping on blood-slick stones. The bridge collapsed under the chaos. By the time the sun reached its peak, the battlefield was silent again. Thousands dead. The English routed. Stirling Bridge was not just a victory. It was a revelation. Wallace had done what no one thought possible. He had defeated Edward's army. He was no longer an outlaw. He was a leader, a guardian. The nobles could no longer ignore him. He was named Guardian of Scotland, acting in the name of the absent king, John Balliol. But Wallace, he was not interested in crowns. He did not dress like a lord. He did not live in a castle. He slept in camps and rode with his men. He led by example, not decree, and that made him dangerous not just to the English, but to the fragile pride of the Scottish nobility. Still, for a time, Scotland breathed again. Church bells rang for the first time in months. Children played in the fields without fear. Old women wept at the sound of Gaelic prayers spoken freely, without fear of English reprisal. But peace does not last, not under Longshanks. Edward returned to England in a fury. He summoned his nobles. He raised a new army, larger, stronger, determined. The hammer of the Scots would march north, and Wallace would be waiting. But the land would soon change, the tide would turn, and the blood would flow again, because in the heart of every rebellion is a truth. Freedom is never given. It is taken, and those who dare to take it must be ready to die. The road to Falkirk was not paved with triumph. It was muddy, choked with the stink of horses, the groan of cart wheels, and the slow dread of men who knew what was coming. William Wallace marched with his men, no longer a ragged band of rebels, but an army. And yet, they were still peasants. They bore axes worn from chopping firewood. They wore padded jerkins, not chainmail. Their boots were cracked. Their hands blistered. But their eyes burned with belief. It had been a year since Stirling Bridge. A year of hope, of reclaiming villages, of pushing the English back, step by muddy step. A year of hearing children call his name like it was a prayer. But Wallace knew the price of defiance. He'd seen too many burned churches, too many weeping mothers, to believe that victory would come easily. Edward had returned, and this time, he brought the full weight of England with him. The army that crossed the border in the summer of 1298 was not a raid party. It was a force meant to end Scotland. Over 20,000 men, knights in polished armor. War horses bred for trampling men beneath their hooves. Archers, Welsh longbowmen, grim and silent, carrying the power to pierce through shields, through mail, through flesh, and leading them, Edward Longshanks himself. The king did not ride at the front. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to command the wind. His war machine was deliberate, methodical. Not a charge, but a slow, grinding wheel. One that turned over forests, fields, and men alike. Wallace knew he couldn't defeat them in open battle. Not the way they fought, not on their terms, but if the land was his weapon. If the forests could shield him, if the marshes could slow them. Perhaps he chose his ground carefully. Falkirk, a field bordered by bogs and woods, with just enough space to maneuver but not enough for the English cavalry to thunder freely. Wallace formed his men into Chiltern's great circles of spears, bristling like the spines of a dying animal. A hedgehog of humanity, stubborn and unyielding. It was a formation made not to kill, but to survive. And for a time. It worked. The English cavalry expected chaos. Instead, they met a wall of sharpened ash poles and clenched jaws. Horses reared and bucked. Knights fell screaming beneath their own beasts. The Chilterns held, but they were not alone on that field. Wallace had counted on the support of the Scottish nobles. Men like Robert the Bruce, who spoke of freedom but weighed it against land and legacy. They had brought cavalry of their own. The plan was to flank the English, to strike when the time was right. But the time never came. Some say they hesitated. Others say they fled. Maybe they feared Edward more than they trusted Wallace. Or maybe they feared what Wallace meant, that the people could lead themselves. that crowns were not the only source of power. When the nobles abandoned the field, the sky turned. Edward unleashed his longbowmen. From behind the safety of their own lines, they loosed volley after volley. Arrows fell like black rain, thudding into the ground, into shields, into skulls. The children could not move. They could not run. They could only stand and die. The screaming lasted for hours. Wallace watched his men, farmers, herders, sons of the soil, fall one by one. He tried to rally them. He tried to hold the line. But the English pressed in, and the field became a mire of blood and shattered spears. By dusk, it was over. Scotland's army lay broken. Not defeated in courage, but crushed by precision. Wallace vanished into the woods. He would not be seen again for months. The nobles called him a failure. They stripped him of his title, whispered that perhaps he had been lucky at Stirling, reckless at Falkirk, that he had brought ruin upon the land. But the people the people did not forget. In the glens and forests, they still told stories of the giant who defied a king, of the man who stood while others knelt. And Wallace, wounded and hunted, kept moving. Through cold rivers and shadowed passes, through hamlets where old women gave him bread without a word, through forests where the only company was the wind and the dead. He had no army now, no banners, just a name. But names, when spoken softly enough by the desperate, can still move mountains. Edward thought it was over, that Scotland had been tamed, that the hammer had struck, and the anvil had shattered. But rebellions are not beasts to be slain. They are seeds, and in the ashes of Falkirk, something else was growing, something deeper, quieter. Robert the Bruce, once hesitant, was beginning to stir. But that story, too, must wait, for now, Wallace walks alone. Not defeated. Not yet. Only silent. And somewhere behind him, in the smoke and the mist, a country still waits for a voice to rise again. The forests were quiet now. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural to still, too expectant. The kind of silence where even the birds seem to hold their breath. Somewhere in the damp hush of that green cathedral, William Wallace moved like a ghost. The crown was gone, the army broken. The nobles had retreated to their halls and hearths, whispering of loyalty when it was safe to do so, and silence when it was not. But Wallace did not return home. He had no hearth to return to, no title to protect. What he had left were shadows and memory, and the long, cold echo of Falkirk ringing in his chest like a hollow bell. He was no longer a warrior in the eyes of the nobility, just a fugitive. An outlaw again, hunted through the highlands and lowlands alike. But the people still remembered. In stone cottages and ruined abbeys, in the hush of early morning as the hearth was stoked to life, his name passed from mouth to mouth like a lit candle. They said he had been wounded but survived. They said he moved by night, striking out at English convoys and then vanishing like fog at dawn. They said he had walked barefoot through snow to reach a village in need. They said many things. What they couldn't say was that he was finished, because even in his absence, his defiance lingered. It was in the stubborn tilt of a farmer's chin when English soldiers came to take his grain, in the glint of a knife hidden beneath a wool tunic, in the Gaelic lullabies sung to babes in English-occupied towns. Wallace had become more than a man. He had become an idea. And Edward understood the danger of ideas. The English king, now in the latter years of his reign, knew his enemy better than most. He had crushed armies, razed cities, driven nobles to their knees, but Wallace had evaded him. Not just in body, but in spirit. So Edward changed his strategy. He no longer sought to crush the rebellion with force alone. Now, he would offer peace, bargains. He would divide the Scots from within. He reached out to the nobles, offering them land, money, safety for loyalty, and many took it. They returned to court. They pledged allegiance. They dined in castles while Wallace slept beneath the stars. But Wallace refused. He would not bend, not to gold, not to comfort, not even to exhaustion. And so, when the offers failed, Edward's vengeance returned. It came in the form of fire. Whole villages were torched in his name, crops burned to the root, livestock slaughtered and left to rot in the fields, churches desecrated, their altars shattered and their bells melted down for weaponry. This was not war. It was erasure, a slow, brutal undoing of a people's will. But still. Wallace fought on. He traveled to France, to Rome, seeking allies, seeking anything that might tip the scales. He met with kings and cardinals. He made appeals in ink and wax seals, though his hands were better suited to swords. And then, at last, he returned, not as a savior, not even as a warrior, but as a symbol of defiance, walking still among his people. He knew he was being hunted, knew the price on his head grew larger by the day, but he also knew that courage had to be seen to survive, and so he showed himself briefly enough to remind Scotland that the fire still burned. But fire, when exposed, is vulnerable. In the end, it wasn't a sword that took Wallace. It was betrayal. Sir John Menteith, once a countryman, once a brother, handed him over to the English near Glasgow. Some say it was for coin, others say it was for peace. But Wallace was bound in chains and taken south, across the border, through towns and cities that lined up to gawk at the legend in flesh. He was brought to London. To a city that did not know the taste of war on its own soil, that had only heard of Wallace in whispers and royal proclamations. Now, they would see the man who had defied their king. He was paraded through the streets in a mockery of justice. Dragged behind a cart, head bare, blooded but unbowed, they jeered, threw rat at him, cursed him, but some did not. Some stood silent. Some watched with a strange respect, because there is something in the sight of an unbroken man that quiets even the cruel. At Westminster Hall, he was tried for treason. Treason, they said, as though he had ever been England's subject. Wallace denied the charge. Of course he did. He had never sworn allegiance to Edward. He was a free man of Scotland, and he would die as one. The sentence was brutal, unspeakable. They would make an example of him. They would hang him. But not until he broke. They would stretch him. But not until he screamed. They would cut him open and tear out what made him human. And yet, they say he did not beg. They say his last words were a prayer, or a curse, or a whisper of freedom. No one can be certain, because even in death, Wallace remained a mystery. But what is certain. Is what followed. For Edward, the execution was a final blow. The rebellion had been decapitated. But for Scotland, Wallace's death was not an end. It was a spark. And far to the north, Robert the Bruce stood at a window, watching the sky turn red with sunset. A man torn between ambition and regret. And in that blood-red light, something shifted. He had knelt long enough. Now. He would rise. And then, at last, he returned. Not as a savior. Not even as a warrior, but as a symbol of defiance, walking still among his people. He knew he was being hunted. Knew the price on his head grew larger by the day. But he also knew that courage had to be seen to survive. And so he showed himself briefly enough to remind Scotland that the fire still burned. But fire, when exposed, is vulnerable. In the end, it wasn't a sword that took Wallace. It was betrayal. Sir John Menteith, once a countryman, once a brother, handed him over to the English near Glasgow. Some say it was for coin, others say it was for peace. But Wallace was bound in chains and taken south, across the border, through towns and cities that lined up to gawk at the legend in flesh. He was brought to London. To a city that did not know the taste of war on its own soil, that had only heard of Wallace in whispers and royal proclamations. Now, they would see the man who had defied their king. He was paraded through the streets in a mockery of justice. Dragged behind a cart, head bare, blooded but unbowed, they jeered, threw rat at him, cursed him, but some did not. Some stood silent. Some watched with a strange respect, because there is something in the sight of an unbroken man that quiets even the cruel. At Westminster Hall, he was tried for treason. Treason, they said, as though he had ever been England's subject. Wallace denied the charge. Of course he did. He had never sworn allegiance to Edward. He was a free man of Scotland, and he would die as one. The sentence was brutal, unspeakable. They would make an example of him. They would hang him. But not until he broke. They would stretch him. But not until he screamed. They would cut him open and tear out what made him human. And yet, they say he did not beg. They say his last words were a prayer, or a curse, or a whisper of freedom. No one can be certain, because even in death, Wallace remained a mystery. But what is certain. Is what followed. For Edward, the execution was a final blow. The rebellion had been decapitated. But for Scotland, Wallace's death was not an end. It was a spark. And far to the north, Robert the Bruce stood at a window, watching the sky turn red with sunset. A man torn between ambition and regret. And in that blood-red light, something shifted. He had knelt long enough. Now. The wind over the hills that spring carried a strange silence. Not the hush of peace, but the pause before something breaks. Edward Longshanks believed he had finished the story, cut off its ending, buried its hope beneath iron and ash. William Wallace was dead, his body scattered across the kingdoms like a warning nailed to the bones of Scotland. The nobles had bent, the cities were garrisoned, and the land had been taught the cost of disobedience. But ideas are not buried in soil. They are carried in breath, passed from lips to ears. Wallace's name was no longer just whispered by the desperate. It was remembered by children, mourned by widows, spoken in Gaelic prayers behind locked doors, and far from Westminster's iron halls, one man still listened. Robert the Bruce. He had been many things: Earl of Carrick, grandson to claimants, a man of noble blood with an uncertain spine. For years, he walked the tightrope between loyalty and rebellion, 1 foot in Edward's court, 1 foot in Scotland's fire. He had watched Wallace rise and falter. He had knelt when it was safe to kneel. And now, with the lion dead, he saw the cage they were all still trapped in. Bruce had ambition in his veins. It had been bred into him, generation after generation, sharpened like a dagger passed down through ancestral hands. But ambition is a slow fire. And now, with England distracted and Wallace gone, that fire began to burn bright. He had waited long enough. It was time to choose. In February of 1306, in a small chapel in Dumfries, Robert the Bruce made his choice. He met with John Comyn, his rival, his kin, another claimant to Scotland's empty throne. They were meant to parley, to make peace, to discuss unity. No one knows what words were spoken, only that minutes later, the chapel echoed with steel, and Comyn lay bleeding at the foot of the altar. Some say Bruce struck first, others say Comyn drew a dagger. It doesn't matter. In killing Comyn, Bruce had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had shed the blood of a nobleman in the house of God. He had made war inevitable. And with the blood still wet on the floor, Bruce fled. He rode hard, north and west, towards Scone, the ancient seat of kings. If he was to survive, he would need more than ambition now. He would need a crown. So they crowned him. Not in splendor, not in gold. It was a hurried ceremony, held in the open air. The stone of destiny, Scotland's sacred coronation seat, had been stolen by Edward years before, taken south and locked away beneath the throne of England. No priests dared bless the act. No guards stood watch. But on that cold even March the royal morning, regalia had to be barred. With a small circle of loyalists watching, Robert the Bruce placed a thin circlet upon his head and called himself King of Scots. It was an act of defiance, a gamble of everything. And the world responded like thunder. The English called him a murderer and a rebel. The Pope excommunicated him. Edward Longshanks, aged but still ruthless, gathered his army again. And in Scotland, many nobles turned against Bruce. The Comyns wanted vengeance. The church denied him legitimacy. Even some of his former allies now saw him as reckless a man who had traded peace for a throne made of kindling. And the kindling was catching fire. Within weeks, Bruce was at war. But this was not a glorious campaign. There were no great victories. No walls breached, no castles taken. Instead, there was loss. Bruce's small force was crushed at Methven. His brothers were captured and executed, drawn, and quartered like Wallace before them. His wife and daughter were taken and imprisoned. His sister was locked in a cage, displayed in the town square like an animal. And Bruce himself despaired. He fled into the wilderness, into the mist-covered isles and the bitter cold of exile. Winter in Scotland is not kind to kings without castles. He hid in caves, hunted like a beast, slept in peat bogs, shivering beneath animal skins. He wandered the heather-strewn cliffs, alone, grieving, questioning the crown he'd barely worn. Some say he nearly died that winter. Of hunger, of despair. Some say he came to the edge of a cliff and considered throwing himself to the sea. And yet there is a story. You may have heard it. That one night, as Bruce lay in hiding, broken and near defeat, he watched a spider struggle to climb the roof of his shelter. Again and again, it failed. The web slipped. The creature fell, but it kept climbing. And on the 7th try it reached its mark. Bruce watched. And in that small, desperate creature, he saw something he could not ignore. Persistence. Endurance. A kind of quiet, furious hope. The kind that doesn't roar, it endures. That spring, Robert the Bruce rose again. Not with armies, not with banners, but with conviction. He emerged from the wilderness not as a noble clinging to privilege, but as a hardened leader, baptized by loss, transformed by suffering. He would fight again. And this time, He would not fight for glory. He would fight for survival, for Scotland, for the crown he had bled for, and for every soul who could not. Because kings are not made in ceremonies, they are forged in fire. And Bruce was now fire. The land was waking. Slowly, cautiously, like a creature long buried beneath snow, shaking the cold from its bones. Spring came to Scotland in soft touches, wildflowers pushing up through last year's ash, sheep returning to green hills, blackbirds nesting in the crumbled walls of half-burned churches. And with it came the first word, then another, until the name began to pass from mouth to mouth again. Bruce. Bruce is back. At first, no one believed it. How could he be? The king who'd vanished into bogs and fog, the man whose cause had crumbled in a single season. The nobles had declared him a fugitive. The church had damned his name. His wife was in a cage. His family scattered, imprisoned, executed. His banner torn and buried. And yet, somehow, he had survived. In the far western isles, where the wind never stops and the sea gnaws at the cliffs day and night, Bruce had found sanctuary. Among fishermen and monks, among the poor, among the forgotten. Not in the marble halls of lords, but in the damp peat huts of those who had always lived under boots. English or Scottish, it hardly mattered. They gave him bread, fish, and shelter, not because he was king, but because he was broken, and broken men understand each other. There, among the salt spray and windswept stone, Bruce began again. Quietly. He sent word to the few who might still stand with him. Old friends, outlaws, sons of fallen clans. Not men of wealth, but men of will. It was a kingdom of nothing. No cities, no taxes, no armies, just resolve. And with that, he began his war anew. Not with trumpets, not with knights, but with shadows. This was not Wallace's rebellion. It was not Stirling Bridge or open battlefields. This was the war of the hills, of guerrilla strikes and sudden flame, of swift attacks on isolated English outposts, then disappearing into the glens before a counter-strike could come. Bridges were burned, supply lines shattered. English-held castles were cut off, starved, slowly strangled from the land itself. Bruce became a phantom. His knowledge of the terrain, of deer paths, of narrow passes and hidden wells became his greatest weapon. His men wore no uniforms. They carried what they could. They struck like wolves and faded like mist, and with every success, more joined him. At first, it was dozens. Then hundreds. Then more. Not just fighters, but blacksmiths, farmers, shepherds, stonemasons. Men and women who had buried children, who had fled burning towns, who had prayed to a God that had not answered. Bruce didn't promise salvation. He promised resistance. And sometimes. That is enough. By 1307, the war had changed shape entirely. Bruce was no longer fleeing. He was advancing, one castle at a time. And when Bruce took a castle, he didn't hold it. He destroyed it, stone by stone, timber by timber. Every tower dismantled, every curtain, wall torn down. Not to punish, but to deny. To make sure the English could not take it again. They would not rest in Scottish halls. Not again. And as the land rose with him, as his fire spread north and east, word came from the south. Edward Longshanks was dead. July 1307, the hammer of the Scots, the architect of Wallace's death, the terror of two kingdoms, had died on campaign, on his way north to crush Bruce once and for all. They say his last command was that his bones be boiled, his flesh removed, and that his skeleton be carried at the head of his army to Scotland. Even in death, that command was never fulfilled. His body was buried. His son Edward II took the crown, but Edward II was not his father. Where Longshanks had ruled with iron, Edward II ruled with hesitation. Weak allies, poor judgment, factions at court. He did not command fear, and Bruce saw the opening. He pushed harder. Faster. Bolder. The tide had turned. Suddenly, those who had stayed silent began to speak again. Nobles who had once called him mad now rode beside him. Even the church softened. The Pope, who once damned his name, began to send envoys to listen again. And by 1309, Robert the Bruce held his first true parliament as king. Not in exile, not in hiding. But in the open. He stood tall before his people, not just as a rebel, but as a monarch of a kingdom reborn. And yet, victory was not yet his. The English still held many of the great castles: Stirling, Berwick, Roxburgh, Edinburgh, and with them, the keys to Scotland. But Bruce had learned it. He would not meet them in the field just yet. He would bleed them dry. He would let the land turn against them. And when they were weak, he would strike. This war, he now understood, was not just of armies. It was of will. Of time. And time, now, was on his side. Scotland, once fractured, was fusing. And in the wind that blew across the heather, in the smoke that rose from the ruins of yet another English fort, something else stirred. Not just hope. But belief. For the first time in years, belief. And Robert the Bruce was no longer running. The winter of 1310 came down like a warning, not with storms or floods, but with the slow, grinding weight of cold. The kind that crept through stone walls, turned bread to iron, and made every breath a pale ghost in the air. Snow covered the glens in heavy silence, and in the lowlands, frost clung to the skeletal remains of fields left fallow by war. But war doesn't sleep for snow. Not in Scotland. Robert the Bruce's men moved through the white like wraiths, cloaked in furs, swords wrapped in linen to muffle their draw. They left no banners behind them, only the hush of boots in snow, and the smoldering ruin of whatever they'd come to destroy. The war was no longer about territory, it was about erosion. About denying the enemy shelter, food, certainty. Every castle razed was one less foothold for the English. Every road made impassable, every outpost left empty and cold, was another inch gained, and it was working. Robert was not winning the war in a way that England understood. There were no grand parades, no field where he stood triumphant over the corpse of an English general. His victories were quieter. Hungrier. Slower. But they lasted. Edward II, meanwhile, was floundering. His father's legacy was a chain around his neck, and he wore it poorly. He lacked the iron discipline, the cruel clarity. He appointed the wrong men, trusted flatterers, and ignored those who warned him that the North was slipping from his grasp. His nobles, once united by fear, now turned on each other. And in Scotland, the land listened. In the early months of 1311, Bruce took Roxburgh, not in battle. In silence. His men scaled the walls at night, crawling on hands and knees, wrapped in black, their faces smeared with ash. Some disguised themselves as cattle to get closey, an act of absurdity, perhaps, if it hadn't worked. They slit throats in the dark and opened the gates from the inside. No trumpet sounded. No declaration was made. By dawn, the English garrison was gone, the castle dismantled. Another stone in Edward's crumbling wall removed, and Bruce was already moving. He struck again in Ely and Lithgow. And then Edinburgh. Each time, he left no shelter behind. The English could march north if they wanted, but they'd find nothing waiting for them. No loyal towns, no warm halls, no rest, only cold earth and emptiness. By 1312, it was clear Scotland was no longer losing. It was healing. Not fully, not yet. The scars were deep, the people were still afraid. But they were rising, slowly, like grass through broken stone. Even the nobles who had once turned their backs on Bruce were returning. But not because he had endured gold. And there is power in endurance. Still, Bruce knew that time alone could not win this war. Not forever. The English crown had coin, soldiers, ships. If Edward could rally his kingdom, call in reinforcements, forge new alliances, the tide could shift again. So Bruce reached beyond the border. He turned his gaze to the west, to Ireland. In 1315, he sent his brother Edward Bruce across the narrow sea into the heart of a fractured, occupied land. The English held much of Ireland in tight, brutal fists. But they, too, were loath. Bruce offered something else. Not conquest, but rebellion. The idea was bold, reckless, even. But it made sense. Divide England's forces. Open another front. Let the fire spread. Edward Bruce landed with thousands of men and was crowned High King of Ireland within the year. It was a campaign of ambition, and it drew English strength away from Scotland's soil. And for a time, it worked. But Ireland was not Scotland. And Edward Bruce was not Robert. His campaign, though fierce, was poorly sustained. The Irish chieftains were fractured, their alliances brittle. His methods were harsh. And by 1318, he would be dead, his head delivered to Edward II. Still, the message was clear. Scotland was no longer contained. It was no longer just defending. It was reaching out, daring to expand, to strike beyond its broken borders. Back at home, Robert continued his slow campaign. He marched into Aberdeenshire, where once his enemies had laughed at his exile. He reclaimed the north one tower, one bridge, one village at a time, and everywhere he went, he held justice. His justice, not the cruel hand of vengeance, but the kind that the poor remembered. A man caught stealing bread was not maimed, but fed. A village that once bent to Edward's men, out of fear, was forgiven if it swore loyalty anew. Because Bruce knew something deeper now. You don't rule Scotland by iron alone. You rule it by giving its people something they had been denied for too long, a reason to believe, and they did. They began to sing again. Not openly, war was still near, but quietly, in the hearth glow of cottages. In lullabies sung to children who no longer remembered peace. Ballads of the man who rose from exile and rode like wind. The king of the north whined. They called him. By 1313, only one great castle remained. Stirling. A symbol. A gate between north and south. A wound that refused to close, and Robert Bruce knew. It had to be taken, but the English had fortified it, reinforced, garrisoned. They would not surrender it lightly. And so Bruce prepared. He sent his men, gathered his captains, sharpened every blade, because he knew what was coming. Edward II, at last, was moving, a new army, thousands strong, the largest force England had sent in a generation. And it was marching north, toward Stirling, toward Bruce, toward the battle that would decide the fate of a nation. It was June. And the fields of Bannockburn waited. The fields of Bannockburn stretched wide beneath the summer sun, rolling, uneven, and green with new growth. They looked peaceful, even beautiful. But beneath that calm lay the bones of old wars, and soon they would drink deeply of blood again. June 1314. The day Scotland held its breath. Edward II's army was immense, over 20,000 men, perhaps more. The largest force ever sent north, knights gleaming in polished mail. Heavy cavalry snorting beneath their riders, hoofs churning up the road like thunder. Wagon trains stretched for miles, filled with weapons, food, siege gear of everything a king might need to conquer a land and break its people for good. And behind it all, Edward himself. He had come to reclaim what had been slipping from his hands for nearly a decade. Stirling Castle, still held by the English, had agreed to surrender if not relieved by midsummer. That deadline was now just days away. Edward had no choice. He had to win. He believed he would. After all, he had the numbers, the armor, the gold, the might of England itself. And yet, waiting for him in the woods beyond the Bannockburn, on high ground where the trees grew thick and the earth turned soft beneath the weight of war horses, stood Robert the Bruce, with fewer than 7,000 men. His army was lean, hardened by years of blood and winter, not parades. They did not gleam. They were scarred, sunburned, and quiet. Farmers with pikes, hunters with bows, minor lords in patched leather. Men who had seen too much to be afraid of what came next. They had chosen this field for a reason. It was narrow, cramped between the burn, a small river choked with reeds, and the forest. The perfect place to choke an invading army. Bruce did not need open ground. He needed discipline, patience, and the land itself. He rode among his men before the battle, not in gold or silk, but in a simple surcoat. His armor bore the marks of old fights, and his sword hung low at his side. He spoke softly, briefly. There were no grand speeches, only quiet reminders that they stood on their soil, that they had already survived the worst, that this was their moment. And then, it began. The English vanguard arrived first, unaware of the trap waiting ahead. It was then that Bruce himself stepped into legend. An English knight, Henry de Bohun, spotted Bruce across the field, mounted, lightly armed, alone. A king, they said. Ripe for the taking. De Bohun charged, lance level, horse thundering beneath him. Bruce did not run. He waited. And at the last moment, he turned his small palfrey aside, rose in the stirrups, and brought down his axe with a single, split the knight's helmet hand still in two. The field went still. A king had slain a knight in single combat. And more importantly, he had not flinched. It was not just a victory. It was a message. The next morning, the battle began in earnest. The English poured into the narrow ground, their massive numbers pressing forward, confident, unafraid. They were used to crushing resistance, to stamping out rebels like rats beneath their boots. But this was no ordinary field. The ground was soft and even. Horses struggled in the mud. The long English lines could not maneuver, hemmed in by the burn and forest. And the Scots were ready. They rose from the woods in Chiltern's tight, bristling circles of spears, trained by years of war to move as one. Shields locked, spears out, a wall of death. They met the English charge head-on and held again and again. The cavalry broke against them like waves on stone. Archers tried to break the lines, but Bruce had anticipated them. He sent his own cavalry light, fast looping behind, scattering the bowmen before they could lose a second volley. The English army, trapped, began to turn on itself. Confusion rippled down the lines. Orders were shouted, lost, reversed. Knights crashed into infantry. Horses fell screaming into the boggy ground. The Scots pressed forward not with wildness, but with brutal, methodical rhythm. Push, strike, advance, hold. And then they broke. The English line, once so proud, so certain of itself, buckled, and panic took hold. Men turned to flee, only to find the river at their backs. They drowned, trampled each other, fell on their own swords in the press. Edward himself was pulled from the chaos by his bodyguards and dragged from the field, retreating south in disgrace. The sun set on Bannockburn that evening, not on a battlefield but on a rout. The field was covered in broken lances, torn banners, and the still forms of once mighty men. Stirling Castle surrendered soon after. Scotland had won. Truly. Decisively. For the first time in years. The war was no longer a question of endurance. It was a triumph. And Robert the Bruce, once an outlaw, once a king without a crown, stood now as the undisputed leader of a free nation. But freedom is not born in a day. The war would not end overnight. Edward still ruled in England. The Pope still withheld recognition. And the scars across the land, burned villages, shattered clans, empty homes, will take years to heal. But something profound had shifted. The myth of English invincibility was shattered. The people, once battered and scattered, had seen what unity could bring. And Bruce, who had known loss more intimately than most, now carried not just a crown but the weight of a country's hope. The wind over Bannockburn blew cool that night. It carried the smell of fire and the faint, lingering echo of drums. But also something gentler, something new, a breath. The victory at Bannockburn rippled through the world like a sudden break in still water. Not just in Scotland, where the hills erupted in song and sorrowful prayers became joyous chants, but across every hall and court where the name England had once held weight like iron. Bannockburn did more than shatter an army. It shattered the illusion that Scotland could be broken, that Robert the Bruce was a pretender, that England's rule was inevitable. Now, a new truth was rising from the earth, bold and undeniable. Scotland had bled, survived, and stood. And Robert was not merely a king. He was the king, but the crown, once seized, does not settle quietly on the brow. Victory did not bring peace. It brought expectation. In the first weeks after the battle, Bruce did not bask in triumph. He did not rest. There were no feasts or golden processions. His war-worn army marched onward, turning toward the remaining English garrisons still clinging to Scottish soil. One by one, the final outposts were rooted out. They found soldiers starving behind thick stone walls, still waiting for reinforcements that would never come. Some surrendered, others chose to die fighting, blades drawn in desperate silence. The last of Edward's grip on Scotland was fading. And yet, the war was not truly over. England still refused to recognize Bruce's rule. The Pope, caught between kings and kings' threats, still excommunicated him. Trade routes were strained. Noble families in the borders lived with one eye on the horizon. Any peace was temporary, and an easy truce built on exhaustion, not trust. So Bruce turned his gaze outward. He understood what Edward had once known. The best defense was reach. And now it was Scotland's turn to push south. In the years after Bannockburn, the Scots began raiding into northern England. Swift, surgical incursions. They crossed the border not as invaders, but as shadows. Villages were emptied, strongholds tested. It was not conquest. They had no interest in holding English land. It was message, punishment, a reminder. For every hamlet burned in the Highlands, there would be fire in Northumberland. For every Scot imprisoned in London, there would be a garrison made to kneel. These were hard years. Brutal ones. The people in the borderlands, English and Scottish alike, suffered under the weight of vengeance and retaliation. Fields went unplanted. Children were born who never knew a day without the threat of smoke on the wind. Bruce regretted this. He did not glory in it. But he knew the truth. England had never responded to mercy, only to strength, and strength he had now. Meanwhile, Edward II unraveled, shamed at Bannockburn, humiliated before his nobles, suspicion and betrayal festered in his court. He trusted favorites men like Hugh Despenser over seasoned lords, and the realm soured around him. Rebellion stirred in the south. His own barons turned against him. And through it all, Bruce waited. Not idle, not weak. Just watching. In 1320, from the heart of Scotland, came something new, not a sword, but a scroll. The Declaration of Arbroath. It was not written in the blood of knights or the ash of burned castles. It was written in ink by monks, nobles, and patriots. Addressed to Pope John the 22nd, it was both plea and proclamation. They did not ask for permission. They explained that Scotland was ancient, free, independent, that Robert the Bruce had led them not through inheritance or royal favor but by the will of the people, who chose him in their darkest hour. And then, a sentence that would echo across centuries: it is not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life. It was the soul of a nation, bound in words, and though the Pope did not respond with open arms, the message was clear. This was no longer rebellion. It was sovereignty. Still, years passed. The border war dragged on like a festering wound. Armies clashed, then withdrew. Parliaments argued. Cities changed hands. But with every year that passed, Robert's position grew stronger, and Edward's more fragile. By 1327, the pressure finally broke. Edward II was deposed, forced from the throne by his own wife and her allies. And his son, the boy King Edward III, rose in his place, young, eager, inexperienced, and desperate for peace. The time had come. In 1328, 14 years after Bannockburn, England and Scotland finally sat at the same table. The Treaty of Edinburgh Northampton was signed. At long last, Robert the Bruce was acknowledged as King of Scots. Scotland's independence, though hard-won and long denied, was recognized. It should have felt like a triumph, but Bruce was tired. His hair had grayed. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled. His gait had slowed, weighted by more than armor. He had paid dearly for his crown. In blood, in years, in the loss of brothers, friends, lands, and peace. He returned to his home in Cardross, by the banks of the River Clyde, not to rule, but to rest. He spent his final months in quiet reflection, reading scripture, walking gardens, speaking softly to his attendants. And in the spring of 1329, with the war behind him and peace finally blooming like heather through old ruins, Robert the Bruce died. He was 55. They buried his body at Dunfermline Abbey, but his heart, he had commanded it be taken from his chest, sealed in a silver casket, and carried to the Holy Land by his most loyal knight, Sir James Douglas. It never reached Jerusalem. Douglas fell in battle in Spain, still carrying the king's heart into the fray, but they found it, and returned it. Bruce's heart now rests in Melrose Abbey, buried deep in the soil he fought to free. And above it, no crown, no marble statue. Only silence, and the thrum of wind through ancient stone, because some legacies don't need to shout. They endure in the land. The land itself did not weep when Robert the Bruce died. It simply breathed. As if, after decades of fire and frost, of betrayal and blood, it could finally exhale. The heather swayed in the breeze that spring, quiet and soft like the whisper of a prayer long feared to be spoken. The hills, once carved by war horses and siege, lay still beneath clouds that no longer seemed so heavy. But a land, even one at peace, never forgets. And Scotland, newly crowned in its own sovereignty, now faced a different kind of trial. The long, uncertain road of holding what had been so hard. One. Robert the Bruce was gone, and with him passed not just a king, but a symbol, a man who had once stood alone in exile, whose throne had been carved from cold and desperation, whose crown was paid for in the silence of fallen brothers and shattered cities. His war had not just been for land but for memory, for the right to say, "This is ours." Now that right had been acknowledged, but who would carry it forward? His heir, David, only 5 years old, was far too young to rule. A child king in a world still trembling from war, a fragile thread of continuity in a land whose unity had always felt more dream than certainty. So guardians were appointed, regents, men tasked with preserving the peace Bruce had bled for. But peace, like fire, flickers when left unattended. Old enemies stirred again, not from England, not yet, but from within. There were still those in Scotland who had never truly embraced Bruce's rule. Men who had lost lands during the wars, who had fled to English courts and now saw opportunity in his death. Chief among them, Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John Balliol, England's old puppet. He had waited in the shadows for years, watching, gathering support, and across the border, England's new King Edward III, young, ambitious, and eager to reclaim his father's pride, offered him just enough encouragement. Not an open invasion, not yet, but support in whispers. Soldiers in secret. And so, not long after Bruce's body was laid to rest, Balliol landed in Scotland with mercenaries and exiles, men of ambition, not loyalty. The invasion was swift and bloody. The Scots, still recovering, were caught unprepared. At the Battle of Duplin Moor in 1332, Balliol's forces struck hard. Thousands of Scots were killed. Among them, many who had fought beside Bruce, veterans, old and seasoned, brought down in a single night by treachery and steel. Balliol claimed the throne. Briefly, he was crowned at Scone just as Robert had been years before. But the difference could be felt in the air itself. There was no reverence. Only calculation. He ruled for less than a year before he was driven out again, then returned, then fled, then returned once more, each time propped up by English arms. And with each coming and going, Scotland bled a little more. The land did not rise in unified rebellion. It fractured again. Small wars, local feuds, famine, plague. The generation that had stood behind Bruce was vanishing, and in their place came sons and daughters who had known nothing but struggle. The idea of freedom began to dim, not gone, but blurred, clouded by hunger and fear and endless uncertainty. And still, they endured, because Scotland had learned something beneath Bruce's banner that could not be unlearned. That no king, no army, no pope, no power in the world had the right to define them. That sovereignty was not gifted. It was claimed. Time passed. David II, Bruce's son, eventually came of age and returned from exile in France to reclaim his place. He ruled for decades, off and on, through war, capture, ransom. His reign was not marked by greatness but by survival. He kept the flame alive. And that, perhaps, was enough. For what Bruce had left behind was not just a kingdom, but a spirit, a way of being. You could hear it in the voices of shepherds who named their flocks with pride, in the stories told in taverns about the days when kings slept in caves, in the quiet defiance of farmers who planted crops even when armies marched near. It was in the stone ruins where wild flowers grew between shattered towers, in the rhythm of songs sung in Gaelic and Scots, passed down not through parchment, but through memory. And always, there was the heart, buried at Melrose, not hidden, but planted like a seed, a reminder that though kings may fall and treaties crumble, though enemies may return and borders may shift, there are things in this world that endure longer than flags or names or crowns. Conviction. Sacrifice. And the sacred, stubborn belief that freedom is worth everything. The wind still moves over the fields of Ban and Ockburn. It does not shout. The years rolled forward, as they always do, with little care for the stories we wish to keep sacred. Time wore away at the edges of memory, softening once bloody truths into fable. The farmers returned to their plows, the forges were lit again, and children were born who had never heard the scream of cavalry over the hill. It seemed, for a while, that Scotland might rest. But peace is not stillness. It is not silence. It is a rhythm, a fragile, pulsing beat that must be protected, again and again, by those willing to bleed for its continuation. And Scotland, though scarred, was not broken. After the death of David II in 1371, the crown passed to a new branch of the old house, the Stuarts, a name that would echo across centuries, stitched forever into the fabric of both Scotland and England, though no one then could have foreseen how far it would stretch, or how violently it would twist. Robert II, grandson of Bruce through his daughter Marjorie, took the throne. He was an aging warrior, cautious and quiet, with none of Bruce's fire, but enough of his blood to hold the crown with dignity. And in his coronation, something settled, a line begun by a rebel king, now made royal by birthright. The Stuarts brought continuity, at last. But also ... storms. The kingdom they inherited was restless. Not rebellious, but wary, like an old wolf nursing wounds, keeping one eye open, even while it sleeps. Nobles, grown powerful during the wars, were reluctant to yield to a single crown again. The Highlands remained largely untamed, ruled by fierce clans whose loyalty lay first with blood, then with land, and only then perhaps with crown or kirk. In the Lowlands, rival families jostled for influence, each remembering slights that had gone unpaid. And always, the border, that jagged, bitter line between England and Scotland. A line etched not by stone or river, but by war and weather and bone. Raids continued. Not by armies now, but by reavers, horsemen of the marches, half-banded, half-hero. They lived by theft and sword, stealing cattle, burning farmsteads, riding under moonlight with banners hidden beneath their cloaks. They answered to no king. Only clan. It was said a man could ride 100 miles along the border and never set foot on land not claimed in blood. The kings of Scotland could do little to tame them. They were part of the land itself. So the Stuarts turned inward, focusing on consolidating power, building alliances, raising sons to rule and daughters to marry into foreign courts. They worked not in steel, but ink can be just as deadly as iron. Robert III followed his father, but his reign was marred by tragedy, a gentleman, but weak in rule. His own brother, the Duke of Albany, grew stronger by the day, casting shadows over the throne. And then came James, a boy, barely 8 years old when his father, fearing assassination, sent him across the sea to France for safety. He never arrived. The English intercepted his ship. James was taken to London, held captive for 18 years. And while the boy grew into a man behind English walls, learning their language, studying their courts, absorbing the shape of their politics like breath, his homeland unraveled. Nobles ruled in his absence, ruthless, territorial, unchecked. The Stuart crown, once a promise, now looked like a question. But James did not forget who he was. When he finally returned to Scotland in 1424, he came not as a broken prisoner but as a sharpened blade. King James I, and the land felt his return like a sudden storm. He was methodical. Cold. Brilliant. He brought order, swift and merciless. Those who had profited during his captivity were stripped of their power. Some were executed, their bodies displayed in public squares as warnings. Justice returned to the courts. Coin returned to the treasury. The crown, once dimmed by absence, blazed again. But power breeds fear, and fear breeds knives. In 1437, while staying in a monastery near Perth, James was murdered by conspirators. Stabbed dozens of times, cornered, hunted through stone corridors as his queen screamed and guards died buying him moments. They found his body hidden beneath the floorboards, soaked in blood. The man who had reclaimed Scotland's throne died not in glory but in flight. Yet even in death, he cast a long shadow. His son, James II, took the crown as a child. And once again, Scotland stood at the edge of uncertainty. But by now, the rhythm had been learned. Kings may fall, borders may burn, but the heart of Scotland beat on. In its people, in its hills, in its stories. And in the fire that never truly went out. Even as it dimmed to embers, it waited for the next wind, waited to rise. The years that followed were thick with smoke and ambition. Scotland, still clutched in the hands of the Stuart dynasty, moved forward like a wounded creature, half limping, half lunging, uncertain whether to hide or strike. The crown passed from father to son, often too soon, often through blood. And with each transfer, the throne seemed a little heavier, a little colder beneath the weight of centuries. James II had been just 6 years old when he became king. A boy in a palace of wolves, he was crowned with trembling hands, beneath banners that still dripped from his father's murder. And those first years were chaos, ruled not by kings, but by men who circled like vultures around a throne made vulnerable by youth. But James grew quickly, and he remembered. He remembered the silence of his father's tomb, the whispering halls where loyalty had died, the long shadows cast by men who called themselves guardians but were anything but. When he came of age, he did not forget. James II ruled with fire in his eyes. He crushed the Black Douglases, once the most powerful noble family in Scotland. They had grown too bold, too rich, their private armies almost equal to the king's. James invited their chief to Stirling Castle under a banner of peace, and stabbed him through the heart, with his own hands. No trial, no pretense. Just steel and silence. It sent a message. This would not be a king ruled by fear. It would be a king to be feared. But kings are not made only of wrath. James II brought reforms, rebuilt cities, strengthened the crown's grip on a fractured kingdom. He brought cannon to Scottish battlefields, great iron mouths that thundered against enemy walls. His was a reign of modernization, of painful progress, until it ended in a flash of fire. In 1460, while laying siege to Roxburgh Castle still held by the English. One of his own cannons exploded beside him. They say the iron tore through his leg, severing it. He bled out on the battlefield. Another Stuart gone, too soon. Another crown passed down to a child, James III, another boy king, another season of regents and rivals, of hungry lords carving up the realm while the child played with stones in palace courtyards. But this time, something deeper broke. James III never truly held the people. Where his father had ruled with thunder, he ruled with distance. He trusted foreign artists, alchemists, astrologers. He wore strange fashions. He stayed behind castle walls when the realm demanded swords. He loved music more than battle, solitude more than spectacle. Scotland did not know what to make of him. They whispered. They questioned. And when storms came, he was not ready. His own son James IV took up arms against him. The nobles rallied behind the young prince. There was no grand rebellion, no climactic duel between father and son. Just a slow drift of power away from the throne until, one day, James III found himself without an army. He fled the field at Socherburn and was cut down in the dark, likely by a hired blade, while trying to reach shelter. His body was found slumped in the mud. Another Stuart, another shadow, but from that blood rose something extraordinary. James IV. At just 15 years old, he wore the guilt of patricide like a chain across his chest. For the rest of his life, he would wear an iron belt beneath his royal robes of penance. A reminder, but James IV would become something rare, a true Renaissance king. He spoke many languages, founded Scotland's first printing press, studied science, literature, and medicine. He ruled with charisma, with intelligence, with vision. His court was lively, his army strong. He built ships, magnificent ships, great wooden leviathans to rival the fleets of England and France. And the people loved him. Under James IV, Scotland bloomed. Trade flourished. Castles rose. Peace, for a fleeting moment, seemed possible. He married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, binding the crowns in blood. A fragile thread of unity between two ancient enemies. But history is rarely kind to fragile things. In 1513, bound by a treaty with France, James IV marched into England while Henry VIII was away fighting on the continent. He led an army across the border, proud and ready, believing perhaps too deeply in the chivalric tales he'd grown up reading. And at Flodden Field, he died, cut down in the mud and blood of battle, surrounded by the bodies of thousands of his countrymen. His banner trampled, his sword lost, his body never definitively recovered. Some say his remains were taken by the English and buried without ceremony. Others say he was never found at all. Only his memory returned, and the throne once again was draped in sorrow. Scotland mourned not just a king but a golden age, ended in a single afternoon. And the crown passed once more to a child, James V, barely 17 months old. And Scotland, weary and blooded, braced itself for another storm, because every time peace seemed near, it slipped through their fingers like rain. James V was born into a silence that felt heavier than mourning. It was the silence of a people who had seen too much. The bells of Flodden still echoed in the bones of Scotland, mothers weeping over unburied sons, widows stitching black into their sleeves, villages emptied of men and filled with ghosts. The flower of Scottish nobility had died that day beside their king, and the soil drank it in without mercy. And now, once again, an infant wore the crown. James V, son of the slain James IV and Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, was a child caught between two kingdoms. Blood of Scotland, blood of England. A boy king in a world of wolves. His mother served as regent, but her loyalties were torn. She was English by birth, and, though she loved her son fiercely, Scotland regarded her with suspicion. Her marriage to Archibald Douglas, a powerful and ambitious noble, only deepened that distrust. The realm fractured again. The Douglases seized control of the young king, ruling in his name, keeping him isolated first as a puppet, then as a prisoner. But James V was not made to be ruled. He escaped their grasp at the age of 16, fleeing the Douglas stronghold in a daring night ride to Stirling Castle, where loyalists gathered to receive him like a lost prophet. From that moment forward, he ruled in full. And he ruled hard. James was no dreamer, no scholar king. He was sharp, paranoid, and unyielding, a man made by betrayal. He remembered every slight, every silence. Every noble who had bowed too low or not low enough during his captivity, he broke the Douglases, crushed their lands, scattered their name. He built alliances through marriages, first with Madeleine of France, who died mere months after arriving in Scotland, pale and coughing, taken by the cold she was never meant to endure. Then with Mary of Guise, a strong-willed noblewoman who bore him 2 sons, though neither would live long. James ruled with pride. He strengthened the law, brought stability to trade, and crushed dissent with an iron fist. He expanded the influence of the crown into the Highlands and Isles, places that had long resisted royal touch. But he was also a man consumed by appearance. He built lavish palaces Falkland, Linlithgow, sterling halls of light and painted ceilings, where music and poetry bloomed even as poverty simmered just beyond the gates. He hosted foreign dignitaries with opulence, projecting strength through gold and ceremony. But beneath it all, he feared England. He had seen what it did to his father. He watched Henry VIII, his uncle, grow monstrous, severing ties with the Pope, beheading wives, crushing rebellion with fire and steel. And James, devout in his Catholic faith, refused to follow Henry's path. When England broke from Rome, Scotland did not. And that fracture widened into war. Henry demanded James meet him in person. James refused. A king, he believed, should never lower himself to another monarch unless as equals. Henry took this as insult, and so came invasion. English raids swept across the borders, again burning churches, plundering villages, slaughtering those too slow to flee. James raised an army to repel them, but the old curse clung to his shoulders. The campaign ended not in triumph but in chaos. In 1542, at the Battle of Solway Moss, the Scottish army, poorly led, divided, collapsed. James did not fall in battle. He fell after, wasted by illness. Hollowed by defeat, they brought him the news as he lay dying in Falkland Palace, that his queen, Mary of Guise, had delivered a child, a daughter. He was silent for a long time, then whispered the words that would echo across the centuries. It came with alas. And it will go with alas. He died days later. At just 30 years old. And once more, Scotland bowed to a monarch still in SWADDLING. Mary, Queen of Scots, 6 days old. A queen in cradlecloth, a kingdom adrift. The wheel turned again, but this time, it would spin into something far darker, far more tragic than any had yet known. For the fire that now flickered behind the throne was no longer just where it was faith, and the Reformation had already begun to crack the very foundation of Europe. Soon, it would split Scotland like an axe to stone. The cradle of Mary Stuart was still warm when the fires began. Not the fires of war, at least. Not yet, but something older, deeper. The slow-burning embers of belief and doubt, sparked by sermons whispered in back rooms and smuggled tracts hidden beneath floorboards. The Reformation had arrived, and Scotland, still fragile from the blood of Flodden and Solway Moss, stood at a crossroads, its crown on the head of a newborn girl, its nobles divided, and its soul suddenly caught between 2 churches. Mary, Queen of Scots, was too young to understand the world she had inherited, but the world would not wait. Her mother, Mary of Guise, took the reins as regent. A formidable woman, clever, politically sharp, and French to her core. She ruled not as a steward, but as a protector of Catholicism, working to keep Scotland aligned with France against the growing shadow of English Protestantism. And in that struggle, the land itself began to tear, because the people, tired, taxed, and disillusioned, were beginning to listen to new voices. Voices like John Knox, a former priest turned preacher turned exile. Knox returned from Geneva aflame with Calvinist zeal. He did not speak like a bishop. He spoke like a storm thundering in pulpits, railing against idolatry, the corruption of Rome, and the monstrous tyranny of women who, in his eyes, ruled not by divine right, but by ungodly ambition. He denounced the Mass. He condemned the Queen Regent, and to the poor, the hungry, the wounded souls of war-torn Scotland. His fire felt like truth. Protestantism spread not with swords, but with conviction. The nobles, ever watchful for the direction of the wind, began to shift, some out of faith, others out of advantage. Soon, the realm was no longer just divided, it was volatile. When Mary of Guise died in 1560, the last tether holding Catholic power in Scotland snapped. The nobles, now styling themselves the lords of the congregation, declared themselves protectors of the Protestant faith and established a new government. The Mass was outlawed. Churches were stripped of icons. The ancient rituals that had shaped Scottish life for centuries were cast aside in a single breath. And all this, before Mary had even returned. She had been raised in France, a queen in exile, but treated like royalty. Betrothed to the French dauphin, draped in silks and incense, schooled in the Latin prayers of the church. Her world was candlelight and poetry, not psalm singing and sermon fire. In 1558, she became Queen of France. And 1 year later, she lost it. Her young husband, Francis II, died unexpectedly, and Mary, just 18, found herself a widow in a foreign court that no longer wanted her. So she returned to Scotland to rule a homeland she barely remembered, to wear a crown whose shape had already changed. She landed in Leith in 1561, stepping off the ship in mourning black, a queen without a husband, a Catholic without a mass, a monarch without a clear place, and a kingdom now remade in the image of Calvin. The people watched her with wonder. She was beautiful, graceful, regal, everything they'd imagined, but also foreign. A queen who still clung to old rites in a land now wary of them. She kept the mass in private. She refused to outlaw the old ways completely. She tried at first to govern with moderation. To walk a line that was quickly vanishing beneath her feet. John Knox railed against her. He called her tears a weapon, her charm a curse, her faith a disease. He met with her in private and left unmoved, later preaching sermons that likened her court to Babylon. But Mary endured. She was clever, polished. And she knew that her position was not merely Scottish. It was dynastic, because she had a claim to another throne, the English one. Her cousin, Elizabeth I, sat on it. A Protestant queen with no heir, whose very legitimacy was questioned by Catholics. By many accounts, Mary had a stronger claim, but Elizabeth was wary of her. Wary enough not to meet her, wary enough to watch her from afar, waiting. And so Mary moved carefully, until she didn't. In 1565, she made a fatal choice. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, an English Catholic with a royal lineage. Their union was meant to secure her claim to both thrones, but it brought only disaster. Darnley was handsome, but vain, cruel, and power-hungry. He demanded the crown matrimonial, the right to rule equally beside her. Mary refused. Their marriage soured within months. Then came betrayal. In 1566, Mary's private secretary, David Rizzio, was murdered in front of her eyes, stabbed over 50 times by Darnley's allies while she, heavily pregnant, was held at knife point. It was a warning, one she did not forget. She gave birth to a son, James, who would one day unite the crowns of Scotland and England. But before that destiny could unfold, the world around Mary unraveled. She withdrew from Darnley, grew close to another man, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful noble with ambition in his eyes. In 1567, Darnley was found dead, strangled, after the house he was staying in exploded, and all of Scotland whispered, Bothwell. Whether Mary was involved remains a mystery, but weeks later, she married him, perhaps for love, perhaps for protection, perhaps because she had no choice. But Scotland did not forgive. The nobles rose in revolt. Mary's forces were defeated at Carberry Hill. Bothwell fled into exile, and Mary, once Queen of 2 Nations, was imprisoned. She would never be free again. The Reformation had already claimed the churches. Now, it would claim the crown, and in the space Mary left behind, they took her to Loch Leven, a grey castle on an island ringed by dark water, where the wind never stopped whispering and the stone walls closed in like a sentence. There, Mary, Queen of Scots, once the most elegant woman in Christendom, was stripped of her silks, her freedom, and her throne. She miscarried twins in captivity. She signed her abdication, and the crown passed once more not to a warrior, not to a council, but to a child, James VI of Scotland. Barely 13 months old, the last flicker of the old world extinguished. Mary escaped once, a year later, riding hard across the hills, gathering loyal men behind her, their hearts still loyal to the woman, not the crown. They met the Protestant forces at Langside. She lost. It was her final battle, not just of arms, but of hope. And she fled not north to safety, not to the Highlands where the old blood still ran, but south. To England. To her cousin. To Elizabeth, a queen seeking sanctuary in the arms of another. But sanctuary was not what awaited her. Elizabeth took her in and locked her away, not as a guest. As a prisoner. For 18 years, Mary waited. In castles and manors, under guard, under watch, writing letters in cipher, sending out pleas across Europe, sowing dreams into every careful word. She was still a queen in her mind, still beloved by Catholic monarchs abroad. She was their symbol of the old faith, their chance to undo the Reformation, to place a true Catholic heir on England's throne. Elizabeth knew, and so she waited, too, until Mary slipped, until one letter, one fatal thread in 1,000 was intercepted. A plot to assassinate Elizabeth, restore Catholic rule. Mary's name was there. It was enough. In 1587, they brought her to Fotheringay Castle. She dressed in crimson, the martyr's color. She prayed, forgave her executioners, and walked to the scaffold with the grace of a sovereign. They struck once, then twice, and then the head rolled free from the body, and the age of Mary was over. But her story was not, because her son James VI was still in Scotland, raised among Protestant lords, schooled in Calvinist thought, taught to rule with caution, to smile with reserve, to wield power like a blade hidden in the sleeve. He was clever, patient, and when Elizabeth died in 1603 without heir, it was James who was invited south, King of Scots, now King of England. The crowns united, two nations, once torn by war, now held in the same hands, not by conquest, not by bloodshed, but by lineage, by time, by the long and winding tragedy of those who came before. The union would not bring peace, not truly, not forever, but it brought change, the end of an age of fractured thrones and child kings, the start of something new. Mary's blood had reached the throne she was denied, and her story of love, of faith, of sorrow became legend, not because she ruled well, not because she won, but because she endured. Because even as the world turned against her, even as the voices rose to condemn her, even as the blade came down, she never stopped being a queen. Scotland changed. Its kings became more distant. Its struggles shifted into parliaments and pamphlets, revolutions and reform, but the land remembered. The rivers still run past ruins that once housed rebels and royalty. The heather still blooms beside old stone where prayers once rose through smoke. And in the quiet wind that sweeps across Bannockburn, Falkland, Linlithgow, you can still hear their footsteps. The dreamers, the martyrs. The iron-hearted. The crown. And those who walked without crown or comfort, but with fire in their souls. This is Scotland. Not a story of kings. Not entirely, but of ople. Ragged, defiant, proud. Bound not by borders, but by memory. And a voice that still whispers through wind and war alike. Who are not conquered. We are not done. We endure. And now, if you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. You've wandered with me through centuries of blood and beauty, from windswept moors to royal halls, through battles won, crowns lost, and the whispered prayers of a people who never stopped fighting to be heard. So before you drift off, or stretch your limbs and step quietly back into the world, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Are you watching the rain slide down your window in Glasgow? Are you curled up under a blanket in Toronto, Tokyo, or somewhere I can't even imagine yet? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear where this story found you, and if these long, quiet journeys through the shadowed corners of history help you rest, or think, or feel, consider tapping that subscribe button. Maybe even share this with someone who, like you, finds beauty in the forgotten. Turn off the lights. Let the last echoes fade. Let the past sleep beside you. And remember, Evan, in the stillness, history breathes. Good night, and I'll see you in the next story.